Hello, Athens cult. I mean, Rome cult. Today I'm going to show you how to make data script queries from your IDE, like so. So the first question would be, why would you want to do this? And I'll just take us back to the previous video I made using your own database with Athens. In this tutorial, I showed you how you can export your data from Rome. And you use this query and place it in a normal block. And I just clicked it, and you can see that it's taking a while to respond. So that would be the first reason. If you are trying to query your data directly from Rome from a block, you'll get frustrated pretty quickly because it's quite slow. And not all of the DataScript API is actually exposed to you. So you will not have full control and power, as you would if you were running from an IDE. Now, that's why you would want to do this directly from an IDE. And you have multiple choices. Today I'm going to show you how to do this with Cursive, which is a plugin for IntelliJ. You could also do this in Emacs with the Cider plugin or VS Code in Calva. I haven't done it with VS Code yet, but you can do it with all of them, I presume. It can be slightly more finicky because we're using a browser-connected REPL with ClojureScript rather than just like a normal REPL from Clojure. There's just a few more steps in that process. So if you're having trouble trying to do it those other ways, yeah, just use Cursive. The requirements you'll need will be IntelliJ and Cursive, obviously, and a copy of Athens. The instructions for getting set up are not super explicit here, but if you go to contributing, one of our contributors, Michael, recently he edited this document, contributors.md, and has more explicit instructions as well as the steps you would need to take to get everything set up. Pretty straightforward stuff. So after you have those IntelliJ and the repo, you'll want to go to this blog right here, which is how I set up my project with Shadow CLJS script package. You ClojureScript project. So yeah, we're using Shadow CLJS. Now you don't need to do all this earlier stuff like creating a project because we already have that project. But from here on out, I'll be showing you what to do. But it's all based from this blog post. So assuming you've got Athens, then you run line dev, which will tell you that an HTTP server is running at localhost 3000, which is great. We have that here. And that we have an NREPL server started on port 8777. And you can confirm that because if you go to our Shadow CLJS file, we indeed want the NREPL server to be running on port 8777. And so in this blog's instructions, they tell us to edit a configuration to create a REPL. And so that's what we'll do. Configurations, you create a REPL, new configuration, remote, And then select nREPL, port 8777. And that's all you need to do. I won't actually create it because the steps are really that simple, yeah. And then add localhost, of course. But that's all you really need to do. It's very straightforward. So once you've created that configuration, I will create a new REPL. It's connected to remote nREPL server. And you see the closure version. You can test that this is live. And what we'll want to do is make sure we're connected to the browser. When you're connecting to a ClojureScript REPL, there's multiple steps, but basically you can connect to a Clojure REPL as well as a ClojureScript REPL. And we can test that we're not in the browser ClojureScript REPL, because if we try to write hello world with the JavaScript interop, then we'll see that there's no such namespace. However, if we use the shadow CLJS, shadow REPL, and then connect with :app, this will connect us to the profile that we specified right here in shadow CLJS config file. And then when that happened, you could see that we are now using CLJS instead of CLJ. And the docs for Cursive say that this should change to the environment, but they don't. It's fine though, because now we can run js console.log hello world, see that nothing was returned. But if we go to our browser, we see that hello world was indeed printed. Now comes the question of how we actually make the queries. To do that is by first finding a database. So if you use Datascript and Datalog or Datomic, you know that when you're running a query or a poll, then you actually, each time you're doing it, you're running it against a specific database value. That's handled for you within Rome, because you're always querying against your own database, but that has to be made explicit here. So first we need to use a namespace that has the database. In Athens, you would switch to the namespace athens.db, require Datascript, and then we can find our database right here. Get out of the way, Jeff. Okay, so define the Datascript database right here, and we can test that it's actually available in our namespace by simply calling it out. Autocomplete shows it's there for me. I'll press enter just for the sanity check, and I get that weird undeclared variable. I'm not really sure why. It might be some JavaScript like var like variable hoisting thing. Not entirely sure, and I get that for any of these functions or variables. I'll get that undeclared warning, but it still works, so not questioning it. But yeah, that's our database that we can run our queries against. So now we can try that original query that we run to get all of our data out, which is basically just a see. Oh, yeah, I need to do this. Find. This query just pulls all of the entity attribute value tuples out of your database, so it's a query for your entire database. And I don't want to make this particularly about how you make, like, well, Datalog syntax and all that. That's in the tutorial. But oh, yeah. So if you use the brackets, that'll just pull the first one. And if you take out the brackets, then that pulls all the tuples out for us. So this enables us to make much faster queries than if we were just waiting for those HTML tables to load directly in Rome. We can also use the pull API, which would be something like pull star and like block UID. Maybe just pull any old page here, or any old UID. Oh, and then pull syntax once the database here. UID. There we go. And yeah, so the pull API is super nice because once you have an entity ID or some other identifier for an entity, you can pull all of the fields associated with that entity. And using the combination of the query API and the pull API, I think yesterday I documented pretty extensively Rome's schema just by pulling like example values from the help database. So yeah, and I can post a link to this as well. But you can do all this yourself now. So some resources I recommend for learning Datalog and DataScript are right here. Learn Datalog today is a pretty fun Cohen style stuff, but the explanations are pretty sparse. DataScript Playground has a ton of great examples, many examples. You should just download the repo and run a lot of the examples like line by line locally. The DataScript tests, the unit tests are pretty helpful. There isn't much documentation on DataScript itself. Tonsky basically recommends to read the Datomic documentation directly, which I also recommend. I was pretty hesitant to read the documentation because there's so much. And then there's Datomic on-prem, there's cloud. There's like a lot of Datomic documentation. But at the end of the day, you only need to read pull and query and schema to really understand it. And that's going to be like the source documentation that most of these other repos are going to recommend. Yeah, this is the authoritative source. This was the tutorial for how you would use Cursive and IntelliJ to make Datalog queries on your Rome database. Yeah, thanks.